Okay, here we are for another deep dive. And today we're really getting into something that feels, well, incredibly important right now: adaptability. Think about it like this. History shows us, right? The groups, the civilizations that really thrived, it wasn't always just about being the biggest or strongest. Often it was because they could, adapt. Like those ancient communities figuring out how to live with the river, not just fight it. It's sort of a quiet superpower. Essential, really, for navigating the world we're in today, all the shifts, the changes. And for this deep dive, we're using that exact lens, adaptability, to look closely at a major piece of legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA. Now, we're aiming to cut through all the noise, the political talk, the headlines. Forget the spin. Our team has put in the work here. We've done a really systematic, data-driven analysis of OBBA. The goal was to declutter all the information out there and really understand, how does this huge, complex policy machine actually impact your ability, your fundamental capacity to adapt and, well, thrive?
That's exactly right. That was the mission. And the tool we used, the framework our team developed for this, is called HAPI. It stands for the Human Adaptability and Potential Index. We actually built HAPI for exactly this kind of analysis, to get past the usual political arguments and measure something concrete. How do policies, regardless of where they come from politically, actually influence people's ability to adapt? We look across 5 really vital dimensions. It's our way of offering a nonpartisan evaluation, treating a massive bill like OBBA, not like a political football to be tossed around, but more like a complex machine. We're trying to look under the hood, inspect the gears, understand its real-world outputs, specifically its impact on human capacity to change. So the core question guiding everything we did, the one we're tackling today, is pretty simple but absolutely crucial. Does OBBBA, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, actually make Americans, make you more adaptable, more capable, more ready for the future and all the change it holds? To answer that, we're going to walk you through what our API analysis found. We'll go dimension by dimension, looking at OBBA's impact. And then, we'll pull it all together at the end, give you the overall picture, the composite score, our analysis generated.
Okay, perfect. So before we jump into OBBA itself, let's make sure everyone's clear on HAPI. It's not just another government acronym, right? It's a specific way our team thinks about and measures human capability. Can you break down that APPI framework for us?
Yeah.
What exactly are we measuring here?
Absolutely, yeah. Think of API as maybe like a diagnostic tool, but for human potential in a world that just keeps changing faster and faster. We deliberately designed it to go beyond the usual metrics. Things like IQ scores or just counting degrees. Those things have value, sure. But HPI focuses on something much more dynamic, more fluid, something, frankly, more critical today. And that's an individual's or even a whole society's capacity for change. How well can people adapt? How quickly can they learn new skills? Just as importantly, how well can they unlearn old ways that don't work anymore? And then relearn totally different approaches. That capacity for continuous change, that's arguably the most valuable asset anyone can have in the 21st century. And our AKPI index tracks this across 5 core areas.
5 core areas,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. The first one is cognitive adaptability. This is all about mental flexibility, how we think, how effectively we learn new information, and, crucially, how well we solve new problems, the kind we haven't seen before. Second, emotional adaptability. This is about our inner resilience. Can we manage stress? Can we bounce back from setbacks, navigate uncertainty without getting, paralyzed? Can we stay motivated when things are tough? Third is behavioral adaptability. This is where the rubber meets the road, really. Can we actually change our actions, our habits, our routines? Can we respond effectively to new rules, new norms, new situations in the real world? Fourth, social adaptability. This is the we part. How do we adapt together? How well do we collaborate, communicate across differences? How well do our communities support connection and mutual aid? And finally, number 5 is growth potential. This looks at the long term. It's not just about adapting now, but about our capacity to keep learning, evolving, and contributing meaningfully over our whole lives. Does the environment help us grow?
That's a really comprehensive framework: cognitive, emotional, behavioral, social, and growth potential. So why apply this specific framework to analyze something as huge and complex as OBBA?
Well, because policy isn't abstract. It creates the weather, so to speak. It shapes the environment where human potential either gets nurtured or, frankly, stifled. Think about it. Education policies, right? They directly impact whether people have the cognitive tools for future jobs. Labor laws affect how easily you can switch careers if your industry changes.
Okay, sure.
And things like healthcare access, housing stability, community resources, these aren't just line items in a budget. They deeply affect people's stress levels, their sense of security, their social connections. all of which fundamentally impacts their capacity, their bandwidth, to cope with and adapt to other changes happening in their lives or in the world. Adaptability isn't just, something you're born with. It's heavily influenced by the systems around you. And here's the key insight from our team's work. The more adaptable individuals are, the more resilient the entire society becomes. So if we can align national policies to actively support human adaptability across all these dimensions, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, social growth, we significantly increase our collective chances of success. Navigating economic shifts, tech disruption like AI, you name it. We often use the chameleon metaphor when we talk about HAPI. That little creature survives not because it's the strongest or the fastest.
Right, it changes colors.
Exactly. It's the master adapter. It changes to fit its surroundings. And in this era we're in, with climate change accelerating, AI transforming industries, global volatility, demographic shifts, maybe America's future depends less on old ideas of strength and more on how adaptable we can be collectively. That's why our team built HAPI. And it's why looking at a major piece of legislation like OBBBA through this specific lens feels so vital right now to understand its real impact on our future readiness.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. Let's dive into the findings then, starting with that first dimension, cognitive adaptability. This is the mental agility piece, right? Learning, pivoting, creative thinking. Does OBBBA help stimulate agile minds?
Yeah, this is really foundational, especially for a knowledge economy and a future that's clearly going to be driven by rapid tech change. Cognitive adaptability is like the processing power for change. It's the bedrock of innovation, critical thinking, being able to pick up new systems or skills quickly. Think about someone like Thomas Edison and the light bulb, all those attempts.
Thousands, right?
Exactly. He didn't see them as failures. He saw them as learning what didn't work. That relentless cycle of learning, iterating, reframing, that's cognitive adaptability in action. It's tied to neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to literally rewire itself. And we see examples everywhere, if you look for them. A farmer learning to use drones and data analytics to manage crops totally different from how their parents farmed, or a veteran whose manufacturing job disappears but they retrain and become a data analyst, or a teacher figuring out how to effectively use new AI tools in the classroom, not just fear them. These are all cognitive shifts.
Okay, so how do we nurture that kind of adaptability across a whole population?
Well, our research suggests societies need to invest deliberately in 3 key pillars to really boost cognitive adaptability at scale. First, you need widespread, equitable access to lifelong learning. Education can't just be a K-12 or college thing anymore. It has to be continuous. Second, you need active support for foundational innovation and research, pushing boundaries, exploring new ideas. And third, you absolutely need equitable access to digital infrastructure. Because let's face it, so much learning and problem solving today happens digitally.
Right. Lifelong learning access, innovation support, and digital access.
Got it.
So based on your team's HAPI analysis, how does OBBB actually perform against those 3 pillars?
Okay, let's take the first one, access to lifelong learning. As we said, continuous learning is crucial. People need to upskill, reskill, maybe change careers entirely, multiple times potentially. Our analysis found OBBBA makes some pretty significant changes here. And frankly, the trend we identified seems to be towards potentially restricting access, especially for certain key groups.
Restricting? How so?
Well, specifically, the bill includes a proposed cut of, I believe, $1.5 billion in funding for Pell Grants.
Wow, okay. Pell Grants are huge for low-income students.
Absolutely critical, need-based grants. Losing that funding or even reducing it is a major barrier. The bill also appears to tighten eligibility rules for federal student loans, making it harder to borrow. And on top of that, it reduces options for public service loan forgiveness, and for people who take lower-paying public service jobs, counting on that eventual relief.
So what's the likely impact of those changes combined?
The impact, according to our analysis, could be significant deterrence. For low-income folks, first-generation college students, non-traditional learners, people trying to go back to school later in life, maybe juggling work and family, at the very time the economy demands more flexibility, more career pivoting, putting up new financial roadblocks to getting the necessary skills. That directly limits our national cognitive agility. It makes it harder for people to retool their minds. It makes you think about the post-WWII GI Bill, right? That wasn't just a thank you to veterans. It was a massive investment in the country's brain power.
Yeah, transformed a generation.
It really did. Unprecedented access to education and training. It fueled decades of innovation and growth. So looking at OBBBA through our API lens, we had to ask, does this bill follow that tradition? Does it invest broadly in unlocking cognitive potential? Based on these specific provisions regarding education access, our analysis suggests it It creates some real challenges to that tradition. It seems to move in the opposite direction in some key ways.
That's a really stark contrast. Okay, let's move to the second pillar. Support for research and innovation. Is OBBA sparking curiosity, fueling new discoveries?
OBBA does have some measures aimed at R&D. For instance, it includes tax incentives for companies that conduct their research domestically, keep the innovation here. And there are provisions encouraging tech transfer, specifically from defense projects into the civilian sector, applied research, taking military tech and finding other uses.
That sounds potentially positive.
It can be. But our analysis flags some important limitations if the goal is broad cognitive adaptability across society. The bill, as we read it, doesn't significantly boost overall civilian R&D budgets or create major new funds for basic curiosity-driven science or innovation in education itself outside of that defense context. So what that risks creating, in our view, is a kind of fragmented innovation system. You might get boosts in specific areas, defense tech, maybe corporate R&D chasing near-term profits, but doesn't necessarily foster that broad ecosystem where breakthroughs happen in public health or fundamental science or education methods or grassroots community innovation. These are often where the biggest societal cognitive leaps originate. There's also no explicit mention of support for interdisciplinary research, which is often where the really novel ideas spark,
Yeah.
at the crossroads of different fields.
Right, like combining arts and tech or biology and engineering.
Exactly. Think about the heyday of Bell Labs. Their incredible success wasn't just targeted incentives. It was a unique mix of public and private funding for basic research, long-term thinking, letting smart people follow their curiosity. OBBA's reliance mainly on tax incentives and defense spinoffs, while helpful in some ways, might not cultivate that same kind of broad, fertile ground for widespread cognitive advancement. It feels more targeted, maybe shorter-term focused.
Okay. And the third pillar, which feels absolutely critical today, digital infrastructure and access, getting everyone connected and digitally literate. How does OBBA address this?
This was an area where, honestly, our analysis found OBBA shows surprisingly little emphasis, which is striking, given how central digital access is now to learning, working, participating in society.
Really, minimal emphasis.
Yeah. Our findings highlight a real lack of specific, dedicated provisions. There's no major targeted funding earmarked to finally close the digital divide, that gap between people with good internet and devices and those without. We didn't see mandates or significant investments to ensure everyone gets access to essential 21st century skills training, like AI literacy or coding, regardless of where they live or their income. And there's no mention of expanding the E-rate program, which helps schools and libraries get affordable broadband, a program that's been around for years.
What's the risk of not addressing that digital divide?
The risk is huge. Millions of Americans, especially in rural areas, low-income urban neighborhoods, tribal lands, they still lack reliable, high-speed internet or the devices to use it. Without that basic foundation, their ability to dial up cognitive agility for a digital world is just severely hampered. They can't easily access online courses, remote jobs, essential government services moving online, telehealth, the list goes on.
It creates almost like a two-tiered system for adapting.
Precisely. Look at what South Korea did with their Cyber Korea initiative years ago, an ambitious national project to connect schools, train teachers. The payoff was enormous. A digitally fluent workforce, a global tech leader. Our analysis suggests OBBBA seems to be missing that kind of visionary investment in digital empowerment as a core driver of national cognitive adaptability. It feels like a major blind spot.
Okay, so pulling that all together for cognitive adaptability, the learning, the innovation, the digital access, what's the HAPI score your team assigned based on this analysis?
Right. Based on our comprehensive look at OBBA through this cognitive lens, considering all those factors, the HAPI cognitive adaptability score for OBBA is 5.2 out of 10.
5.2, just barely above the midpoint. How did you break that down?
We scored each pillar based on the provisions we analyzed. For education access, we gave it a 4.5. The cuts to aid and limited scope for broad upskilling seem likely to stifle educational mobility for many. For research and innovation support, a 6.0. There's some support, yes, but it feels siloed, lacking that broad civilian surge. And for digital inclusion, a 5.0. It's barely addressed, frankly, which risks widening the existing gap in digital readiness and cognitive opportunity.
So with that 5.2 score, what's the resulting adaptability gap here? What specific things are missing if we wanted to really boost cognitive potential?
Our analysis highlighted a few key missing pieces. A big one is dedicated lifelong learning infrastructure. We need clear pathways and financial support for people to pivot things like targeted upskill scholarships for workers displaced by tech or older professionals needing a career change. Another is broad AI and tech literacy for all. It's not enough just to build AI. We need investment so everyone understands how to use it, interact with it ethically. That's fundamental cognitive readiness now. And we need modern community learning hubs. Think revitalized libraries or new centers offering practical tech training, coding boot camps, job search support right in local neighborhoods, accessible to everyone.
Makes sense. Any final thoughts on OBBA and cognitive adaptability?
Just that cognitive adaptability is the core competitive edge now for individuals, for the nation. Our analysis suggests OBBA, despite its size, lacks a truly coherent strategy to nurture this across the board. It kind of seems like it might inadvertently help those already equipped to adapt, while potentially making it harder for those who need the most support to retool their thinking and skills. You just can't build a resilient future workforce without serious, broad investment in mental agility for everyone.
Okay, let's move to the second HAPI dimension, emotional adaptability. This gets into our inner resilience, managing stress, bouncing back, psychological well-being. How does OBBA impact our ability to navigate uncertainty and stay psychologically strong?
Emotional adaptability is absolutely fundamental. It's the bedrock of resilience. It's not about suppressing emotions, but having the internal skills and, crucially, the external resources to cope effectively with stress, adversity, and change. It's about being able to process difficult things, regulate your emotional responses, keep perspective, and keep functioning even when things feel unstable or overwhelming.
And what are the key factors that support that kind of adaptability?
Our API framework identifies several critical components. First, straightforward access to mental health services, affordable therapy, counseling, psychiatric care when needed, treating mental health like physical health. Second, strong social support systems, family, friends, community groups, programs that offer comfort and practical help, that feeling of connection. Third, economic stability. This one's huge. Chronic financial stress is just incredibly corrosive to emotional well-being and the capacity to cope. And fourth, comprehensive healthcare coverage that explicitly includes good mental health coverage, putting it on par with physical health.
All right, so how does OBBBA stack up against those components based on your team's analysis? Does it help build emotional resilience, or does it potentially add more strain?
Our analysis of the source material indicates that OBBA introduces some significant changes, especially around healthcare and economic support, that could pose real challenges to fostering broad emotional adaptability.
Challenges like what?
Let's look closely at Medicaid and mental health coverage. OBBA includes provisions to implement work requirements for Medicaid eligibility in many places.
Right, that's been discussed a lot.
Yes. And for people who find it hard to consistently meet those requirements, maybe due to health issues, caregiving, unstable jobs, they could lose their health coverage entirely. Our analysis suggests that losing coverage like that dramatically increases stress, and it directly cuts off access to mental health services that Medicaid often provides, especially for lower-income individuals. On top of that, there are proposed cuts to overall federal Medicaid funding. This could force states to scale back mental health programs, particularly in areas that are already underserved.
So the impact could be pretty severe for vulnerable groups.
That's the concern highlighted in our analysis, yes. Worsening existing disparities in mental health access, hitting low-income populations, people with disabilities, folks who rely on Medicaid for that critical support.
Sure.
More stress, more anxiety about losing coverage, less access to professional help. Those are all direct hits to emotional adaptability. It's hard to build resilience when you're constantly worried about basic health care.
What about health savings accounts, HSAs? I know the bill touches on those. Does that help on the wellness front?
OBBA does expand how HSAs can be used. It allows people to use those pre-tax funds for certain wellness expenses, like fitness programs or maybe smoking cessation, up to certain limits.
Okay, promoting wellness is good, right?
Physical wellness definitely connects to mental well-being, absolutely. But the limitation our analysis points out is that HSAs primarily benefit people who have the extra income to contribute to them in the first place. So relying on HSAs for wellness access might not reach the very populations who are losing access to Medicaid or who don't have disposable income to put into an HSA. It makes the benefit less equitable, less broad.
That makes sense. What about community-level support? Does the bill invest in local mental health initiatives, crisis support, things like that?
This was another area where our analysis found a lack of substantial new investment. And these community-based programs are so important for emotional adaptability. They're often the first line of defense, early intervention, catching problems before they become crises. They provide local crisis response, support during community emergencies, and ongoing help for people managing chronic conditions. They build that local fabric of support. The absence of significant new funding really hinders the ability of communities to build that resilience from the ground up to support their members' emotional well-being directly.
Okay, so considering those factors, mental health access, community support, economic stability, healthcare coverage, what's the API score for emotional adaptability?
Based on our team's analysis of OBBBA through the API lens, the API Emotional Adaptability Score for OBBBA is 4.8 out of 10.
4.8. Again, below that midpoint. What drove that score?
Looking at the components, access to mental health services, we rated 4.0. The potential reductions via Medicaid changes seemed like a major barrier. Social support systems, 5.0, largely due to the lack of new investment in those crucial community-based programs. Economic stability, a 5.5. Some potential positives in other areas, but the safety net changes create significant economic stress for vulnerable groups, limiting the overall positive impact. And healthcare coverage for mental health, a 4.5. The Medicaid changes and the reliance on HSAs don't appear to create a robust, equitable system for mental health support.
So the adaptability gap here for emotional resilience seems pretty clear. What needs prioritizing?
Yes, the analysis consistently points to the need to make mental health care truly accessible, affordable, easy to find, no stigma for everyone. And equally important, investing in that community infrastructure, the local programs, the support networks that build resilience right where people live.
Any final conclusion on OBBBA and emotional adaptability?
Just that emotional adaptability isn't a luxury. It's vital for individuals and for a functioning society, especially when things are unstable. Our analysis suggests OBBBA, with its approach to healthcare access and lack of community investment, creates some significant headwinds here. Policies aiming for a truly adaptable future have got to prioritize mental well-being and strong community support systems. You really can't expect people to handle external changes well if their internal foundations are shaky and unsupported.
All right, let's shift gears to the third dimension. Behavioral adaptability. This is about action, changing habits, daily routines, responding when things change around us. Can policy actually help us change our behavior?
Oh, absolutely. Policy is a huge driver of behavior, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Behavioral adaptability is just our capacity to adjust what we do, our actions, our choices, our habits. Think about trying to follow a new complicated recycling program, or adapting your commute if a new train line opens up, or learning how to use a new software system at work, or even just remembering to bring reusable bags to the grocery store. These are all behavioral adaptations.
Okay, so it's the practical side of change.
Exactly. It's how we translate awareness or new rules into actual changes in our lives. And good policy can make this easier. Through nudges, incentives, removing barriers, providing clear information and tools. Our analysis framework looks at three main ways policy influences behavior. 1. Incentives and disincentives, carrots and sticks, tax breaks, fines, subsidies. 2. Structural supports, the actual infrastructure or programs that make a behavior possible or easier, like good public transit or accessible job training programs. And 3. Norm setting, using policy and messaging to signal what kind of behavior is expected or desirable in society.
Okay, incentives, structures, norms. How does OBBA use these levers? Does it effectively nudge us towards adaptive behaviors for the future?
Well, looking at incentives and disincentives, our analysis shows a bit of a mixed bag. Some progress, but also some gaps. On the plus side, OBBA does expand some tax credits, things like credits for making your home more energy efficient or buying an electric vehicle.
So encouraging greener choices.
Yes, clear financial incentives for those specific sustainable behaviors. Though, our analysis notes, these tend to benefit folks who can afford the upfront cost, middle to upper income usually, so the reach might be limited. But then, on the other side, the bill limits some existing tax credits for things like retraining or education expenses. As we discussed, that makes the behavior of switching careers harder financially. And we found minimal direct incentives aimed at encouraging broad preventive health behaviors like healthy eating or regular exercise across the whole population. In fact, there are proposed cuts to SNAP education programs which teach healthy eating habits to low-income families. That seems counterproductive if you want healthier behaviors.
So some carrots, but maybe not enough, and potentially taking away some important behavioral supports.
Sort of feels that way. Think about big societal behavior shifts, like wartime conservation. It wasn't just posters. It was rationing, making certain behaviors necessary, community drives making participation feel normal, real support. OBBA feels more like offering some specific tax carrots, but without a strong push or comprehensive support for widespread behavioral change in key areas.
Interesting. What about the second lever? Structural supports. Does OBBBA provide the actual means, the infrastructure, for people to realistically adopt new behaviors?
Again, our analysis points to some supports, but also some pretty significant omissions in areas that seem critical for future adaptation. On the support side, the bill does include provisions to expand childcare services in some regions. That's a huge structural enabler. It makes it physically possible for parents, often mothers, to adopt new behaviors like going back to work or school.
Right, childcare is definitely infrastructure.
Absolutely. But then look at the omissions. We already talked about the lack of major investment in broadband infrastructure or digital inclusion. How do you expect people to adapt to online work or learning without reliable internet? That's a massive structural barrier. The bill also seems to underinvest in mass transit. If public transit isn't affordable, reliable, and extensive, it's very hard for people to make the behavioral shift away from driving everywhere, even if they want to. And crucially, there's a lack of robust, widely accessible career coaching and job placement systems. Just offering a tax credit for retraining isn't enough. People need guidance, support, pathways to actually make that difficult behavioral transition into a new field.
So it's like giving someone tools but no instructions or workbench.
That's a good way to put it. Our analysis contrasted this with something like Singapore's Skills Future program. They don't just give money, they provide structured guidance, counseling, making the behavior of reskilling much easier. OBBBA feels, as our analysis said, more like handing people a paddle and wishing them luck than providing a clear supported channel for change.
And the third lever, norm setting. What's the overall message OBBBA sends about behavior change? What's valued?
Our analysis described the signals here as, frankly, fragmented, lacking a clear, cohesive story. There isn't an overarching narrative coming from the bill saying, this is the direction we're heading as a country, maybe towards clean energy or lifelong learning, and here's how we're supporting the behavioral changes needed to get there. Instead, you get mixed signals, like expanding EV tax credits, which signals value for green tech, but then cutting S&T education funds, which undermines support for basic healthy behaviors, or tightening student aid while talking about future competitiveness.
So, confusing messages.
It can be confusing, yes. When policies seem to conflict, it's hard for people to get a clear sense of what behaviors are truly prioritized or expected. Widespread behavioral change really thrives on clarity, consistency, a sense of shared direction, and our analysis suggests OBBBA doesn't really provide that strong, unifying behavioral norm.
Okay, let's get to the score. Based on incentives, structures, and norms, what's the HAPI score for behavioral adaptability?
All right, weighing those three levers based on our analysis of OBBBA. The API Behavioral Adaptability score for OBBBA is 4.7 out of 10.
4.7, another one below the midpoint. The breakdown.
Incentives scored 5.5. Some positive elements, especially on energy, but too narrow, benefiting limited groups. Structural supports got a 4.0. Major gaps in digital access, transit, and guided retraining pathways, really underpowered. And norm setting, a 4.5. No clear, coherent call to action or unifying narrative to guide widespread behavioral shifts.
So the adaptability gap for behavior change, what's missing to help people actually do things differently?
Our analysis highlighted a few things. One is the lack of reskilling on-ramps, easy-to-use supportive systems to help people navigate the complex behavior changes of learning new skills and switching careers. Another is ignoring proven, often low-cost, high-impact behavioral interventions. Things like personalized coaching, decision aids built into systems, peer support programs. These are tools from behavioral science that the bill doesn't seem to leverage systematically. And related to that, just an underuse of behavioral economics overall, not really designing policies and programs with a deep understanding of how people actually make decisions and change habits using smart defaults, framing choices effectively, timing interventions well. It feels like an untapped potential.
Final thoughts on behavioral adaptability.
Just that changing behavior is hard work. It's shaped so much by the context, the tools, the signals people receive. Our analysis indicates OBBBA has some pieces, like certain incentives, but it fails to create that comprehensive, supportive ecosystem needed for large-scale behavioral adaptation. If we want people to adapt their actions effectively for the future, policy needs to create environments that make it easier, more intuitive, more supported, like gentle river currents guiding change, not obstacle courses making it frustratingly difficult.
Okay, moving on to dimension 4. Social adaptability. This is about how we adapt together. Communities, collaboration, collective resilience, that go far, go together idea.
Yeah, exactly. Social adaptability is the glue. It binds individual efforts into something stronger, more resilient. It's about how well our communities foster cooperation, promote inclusion so everyone feels they belong and can contribute, and build collective resilience. Can the community as a whole withstand shocks, economic downturns, disasters, health crises, and bounce back, maybe even stronger? That's social adaptability.
What kinds of policies typically strengthen that?
Our analysis points to a few key areas. Strong community development programs investing in local institutions, libraries, parks, civic groups that build social connection. Inclusive infrastructure is vital, ensuring public transit, digital access, community centers are truly accessible to everyone, regardless of income, ability, or background. And education and workforce training that consciously aims to prepare diverse populations within a community, fostering shared skills and reducing inequalities. It's about lifting the whole community together.
So how does OBBA impact this community-level social adaptability based on your team's analysis? Does it strengthen the ties that bind or potentially fray them?
Our findings, based on the source material, suggest that several provisions in OBBA could actually strain communities, particularly by weakening crucial safety nets and underinvesting in shared resources.
How specifically?
Well, regarding community development and support, we've already discussed the proposed significant cuts to programs like SNFP, food assistance, and Medicaid healthcare.
Right. These are lifelines for many families.
Absolutely. And they function as critical community supports. When you reduce these federal safety nets, our analysis indicates it puts immense pressure on local resources. Food banks, charities, free clinics, they often struggle to fill the gap. This can worsen disparities within the community, increase stress on vulnerable families, and potentially weaken the social fabric, the sense of mutual support and trust that is essential for collective resilience. It makes it harder for neighbors to effectively help neighbors.
What about infrastructure that connects people? Transit, broadband, community spaces.
OBBA's general focus on reducing federal spending seems to extend here as well, according to our analysis. This translates into potential limits on federal investment in things like public transportation, which connects people to jobs, services, and each other. It affects broadband expansion, limiting digital connection, which is increasingly vital for community participation. And it impacts funding for community centers, libraries, parks, the physical places where social interaction and connection happen. The effect, our analysis suggests, is hindered connectivity and reduced access, especially hitting rural areas and underserved urban neighborhoods the hardest. This directly impedes their collective ability to adapt together to broader economic or social shifts.
Education and workforce development also play a role in a community's collective ability to adapt. How does OBBA look there?
There are some provisions, like expanding 529 savings accounts or making certain tax credits permanent, which might help some families save for education or benefit certain workers. However, our analysis again flags the restrictive changes we discussed earlier as potentially damaging to collective, community-wide adaptability. The stricter eligibility for Pell Grants, the elimination of subsidized federal student loans, these make higher education and skills training less accessible for many, particularly those from lower-income backgrounds or marginalized communities.
So it limits the community's overall talent pool in a way.
Exactly. It hinders the ability of the community as a whole to upskill its workforce collectively. It limits shared opportunity and can exacerbate inequalities within the community, making it harder to adapt as a cohesive unit. The link with details on these changes is in the description if you want to dig deeper.
Okay, so considering community development, infrastructure, and education access for all, what's the HAPI score for social adaptability?
Based on our analysis of OBBA's likely impacts on these community-level factors, the API Social Adaptability score for OBBA is 4.3 out of 10.
4.3? That's the lowest score so far. Why so low?
The breakdown reflects the concerns. Community development scored 4.0. The potential erosion of community resilience due to safety net cuts is a major factor. Infrastructure and accessibility, a 4.5. Limited investment hampers the connectivity and access crucial for communities to function and adapt together. Education and workforce development, also 4.5. Restrictive changes impede collective skill advancement and equitable opportunity within communities.
How could policies bridge this social adaptability gap? What should the focus be?
Our analysis consistently points towards actively investing in community programs, strengthening those local institutions that build social capital, enhancing infrastructure with an explicit focus on equity, ensuring everyone has access to transit, internet, safe public spaces, and supporting inclusive education, making quality education and training truly affordable and accessible for everyone in the community.
Any final wrap-up on social adaptability?
Just that it's absolutely foundational. A resilient nation is built on resilient communities. While OBBA aims to streamline spending, our analysis suggests its approach, particularly the cuts to safety nets and underinvestment in shared infrastructure, may unintentionally undermine our collective capacity to adapt together. Policies really need to focus on nurturing the networks, the systems, the shared resources that allow communities to evolve cohesively and support all their members through change. Going far requires going together.
Okay, let's tackle the fifth and final HAPI dimension, growth potential. This is the long view. Our capacity, individually and as a society, to keep learning, evolving, reaching our potential. Does OBBBA plant the right seeds for tomorrow?
Growth potential is really about the trajectory, not just adapting now, but having the capacity and the support to keep adapting, learning, and growing over the long haul. It combines things like learning agility, how quickly you pick things up and improve, with upward mobility, whether the environment actually supports you in rising and advancing in skill relevance, making sure you're equipped not just for today's jobs, but tomorrow's challenges. From a policy perspective, it's asking, are we investing in our people's long-term development with the same foresight we might use for, say, building critical infrastructure? It's about investing in human capital for the future.
And what are the core components your analysis looks at for growth potential?
We focus on 3 key areas based on the source material: future-ready education and lifelong learning, economic mobility and opportunity, and foundational stability, things like health, housing, basic security that allow people to focus on growth.
Got it. So how does OBBBA measure up on that first component, future-ready education? Is it setting people up for long-term growth and evolving careers?
Our analysis points to a significant misalignment here, unfortunately. The priorities reflected in the bill don't seem fully geared towards fostering widespread, future-focused growth potential through education. We've touched on this, but the tighter restrictions on Pell Grants, eliminating subsidized loans, reducing support for public education, these create higher barriers, especially for those who need the most support to access growth opportunities through learning. And while things like expanding 529 accounts might help some families, our analysis highlights a real lack of investment in the skills truly driving the future. Minimal new funding for widespread vocational upskilling, for broad-based STEM education, or crucially for ensuring universal AI literacy and digital fluency, these are the keys to 21st century growth potential.
So it's not necessarily investing in the skills needed for tomorrow's economy.
It doesn't appear to be making that strategic, broad-based investment. Think about the German dual education system. It tightly integrates learning and practical apprenticeship throughout careers, keeping the workforce highly relevant. It treats learning as continuous. OBBBA, our analysis suggests, still seems to view education more as a phase you complete, not an ongoing necessity for sustained growth in a rapidly changing world.
What about the second component, economic mobility? Does the bill provide clear pathways, a sturdy ladder for people to climb economically?
There are some elements that could support mobility, but our analysis suggests the ladder is pretty steep and may be missing some crucial rungs for many. On the plus side, the bill includes things to encourage small business formation, tax simplification, some incentives, and maintaining certain tax thresholds might help middle-income earners keep a bit more, potentially allowing for investment and growth.
But what makes the ladder steep?
Several things flagged in our analysis. There's no real comprehensive framework for the huge number of gig workers or independent contractors. They often lack the security, benefits, or clear advancement paths needed for stable long-term growth. There's also limited funding mentioned for things like entrepreneurship incubators or small business support specifically in underserved regions, where they could make the biggest difference in creating new mobility pathways. And fundamentally, growth often involves taking risks, starting a business, moving for a job, investing in training. Risk-taking requires a safety net. Our analysis suggests OBBBA pulls back on some key safety nets, healthcare via Medicaid, maybe unemployment support, without adequately replacing them with robust, accessible ladders and support systems for upward mobility that reach everyone.
That makes sense. You need stability to take risks. Which brings us to the third component, foundational stability, health, housing, even climate resilience. Does OBBBA provide that solid ground people need to focus on growth?
Our analysis suggests these foundations appear rather fragile under OBBBA's proposed changes. The proposed cuts to Medicaid and housing support programs directly weaken that basic platform people need to pursue long-term goals. If you're constantly worried about healthcare or housing, investing in your future growth becomes a luxury you likely can't afford.
It consumes all your bandwidth.
Exactly. And our analysis also noted that the bill reduces investment in clean energy transitions and climate resilience efforts. This not only impacts long-term environmental stability, but also limits the potential creation of future jobs in sustainable industries, a key area for future economic growth and opportunity. Think back to the GI Bill again. It wasn't just tuition. It was affordable housing support, healthcare access. It recognized you need that holistic foundation, health, housing, security, before you can realistically build a future through education and career growth. OBBBA's reductions in these areas, according to our analysis, make it harder for many to even get to the starting line for long-term growth.
Okay, so considering future-ready education, economic mobility, and foundational stability, what's the API score for growth potential?
Based on our comprehensive analysis of OBBBA's likely impact on these long-term factors, the API growth potential score for OBBBA is 4.6 out of 10.
4.6, another score indicating significant concerns, the breakdown.
Education and lifelong learning scored 4.0. Higher barriers, limited investment in crucial future skills. Economic mobility of 5.0. Some support, but limited by exclusions like gig workers and weakened safety nets. Foundational stability of 4.5. Cuts to health and housing support reduce the basic security needed for growth.
So the potential gap here, what's fundamentally holding back long-term growth potential under this bill?
Our analysis points to a few major gaps. First, no clear national reskilling strategy. No plan for how we, as a country, navigate widespread lifelong learning and career transitions driven by AI and other disruptions. Second, significant underinvestment in youth and early childhood. No major new push for things like Head Start, early literacy, support for first-gen college students, the investments that build potential from the very beginning. And third, a lack of a holistic view of human growth. The bill seems to treat education, health, housing, economic support as separate silos, rather than weaving them together into a coherent strategy that supports the whole person's development over their lifetime. Final thoughts on growth potential. Growth potential is about our future competitiveness, our future prosperity. Our analysis suggests OBBBA, while supporting some aspects of business, really fails to build that robust, equitable architecture needed for developing human capital across the board, across generations. Using that garden analogy again, it feels like it waters some specific already thriving plants, but leaves the soil pretty dry and unprepared for nurturing widespread growth across the entire garden.
All right, we've done it. We've gone through all 5 HAPI dimensions: cognitive, emotional, behavioral, social, and growth potential, looking at OBBBA through your team's adaptability framework. Let's pull it all together now. What's the final verdict, the overall picture?
Yeah, after digging deep into each dimension, it's clear OBBBA is incredibly ambitious. Huge scope, lots of changes proposed. But as we've been saying, ambition needs adaptability baked into it to really succeed, especially now. Our goal here, just to reiterate, wasn't to score the politics or the ideology. It was to use our HAPI framework to impartially assess the bill's likely real-world impact on America's capacity, your capacity, to handle change, to adapt. So after weighting the impacts across all 5 dimensions based on our detailed analysis of the source material, we arrived at the final composite API adaptability score for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Okay, the moment of truth.
The composite API adaptability score for OBBBA is 4.7 out of 10.
4.7 overall, so below 5. For such a major bill, what does that score tell us is the fundamental adaptability gap? What's really missing across the board?
That 4.7 signals significant weaknesses, according to our analysis. Several key missing pieces consistently emerged across the dimensions. Critical elements for adaptability that seem underfunded, undermined, or just absent. First, a major gap in lifelong learning infrastructure. The tools, the support, the pathways people need to pivot, to reskill quickly. They seem inadequate or even constrained. Our analysis points to needing something bold, like a national reskilling guarantee, real support for workers needing to transition. Second, the bill seems to undervalue community as a system for adaptability. Strong individuals need strong communities and vice versa. But the proposed cuts to safety nets, the underinvestment in libraries, community centers, local tech hubs that weakens the foundation. We need something like a civic infrastructure stimulus, really investing in those local adaptability hubs. Third, there's a lack of what we call behavioral guidance with dignity. Change needs support, smart design, nudges, not just mandates or penalties. The bill uses some incentives, sure, but lacks that widespread human-centered design. It doesn't fully leverage behavioral science to make positive changes easier for people. We need to apply behavioral economics systematically. Fourth, and this is crucial, not enough support for emotional and mental resilience. People can't adapt effectively if they're constantly stressed, anxious, or lack mental health support. The potential rollbacks in access, the lack of investment in community mental wellness, that's a major gap. We need a real focus, maybe a Mental Resilience Act, expanding access and support, and finally, a lack of unifying narrative leadership. Policy needs a story, a shared mission. OBBA feels like a collection of changes without that clear, inspiring vision for the future that includes everyone. We need to frame adaptability as a national project, like the moonshot, telling an inclusive story of growth and potential.
So, if we were aiming for a perfect score, a 10 out of 10 on adaptability, according to HAPI, what would that look like? What would be in a bill like that?
A 10 out of 10 OBBBA, designed purely for maximum national adaptability based on our framework. It would probably include things like universal access to digital skills and tools, non-negotiable now. Real incentives for personal reinvention, supporting individuals taking risks to grow. Mental health infrastructure truly embedded in every community, easy to access. It would have place-based support tailored for transitions in both rural and urban areas. And critically, it would carry a strong national narrative of empowerment, of shared potential, not austerity. Imagine a bill, any major policy really, designed so well that every single American felt they had a map to navigate change, a guide or mentor available, a meaningful mission, and the basic security and support to actually pursue it. That's what 10 out of 10 adaptability looks like in policy terms, according to our analysis.
Wow, that's a powerful vision. This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into OBBA using your team's HAPI framework. It really highlights how crucial adaptability is and how complex policies can either support or hinder it, sometimes in unexpected ways.
Exactly. Adaptability isn't just a buzzword anymore. In a world changing this fast climate, AI, economics, it's fundamental. The question isn't if we change, it's how well we manage it and how equitably.
We really hope this analysis gives you, our listeners, a new lens, a way to look beyond the headlines at major policies and ask, does this actually help people thrive? Does it build our capacity to adapt? Maybe human adaptability truly is the next great national asset. And as you mull over everything we've discussed, here's a final thought from our analysis to consider. In our own lives, our workplaces, our communities, our schools, how can we actively foster the kind of adaptability, the resilience, the learning mindset that maybe these big policies sometimes miss? What can we build from the ground up? As mentioned, you can find links with more details on the source material and our team's HAPI framework in the description. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.